we are going to move to our last speakers. I think today we're going to finish with the first. They were supposed to be the first, and now they're coming in last. And thank you so much for overcoming the technical problem that we had. We have the Coopers who will be speaking to us now. This is a couple. It's a team of a husband and a wife, and one uses a microscope to solve wildlife mysteries. He is a vet pathologist, while the other, on the other hand, the other one fights for animals in the courtroom. Margaret is a lawyer, and together they're not just partners in life, but they're also saving lives, both for human and wild. And I can happily say they're writing a book on human-wildlife conflict. And we're so happy to have you speak to us today. So welcome to the stage, the Coopers. And by the end of this talk, you should be able to first understand the broader context of human-animal conflict, including the causes such as injury, disease transmission, and property damage. Second, you should be able to examine the legal and ethical frameworks guiding wildlife conflict management and the responsibility of various stakeholders. Thirdly, you should be able to explore how law, policy, and humane approaches can be used to mitigate and manage conflict effectively. Lastly, you should be able to reflect on the philosophical and practical challenges of balancing human needs and animal welfare and biodiversity conservation. Yeah, thank you so much. Over to you.
Right. Well, first of all, we must share our screen, but can we say, Dr. Seller, that summary was so good that perhaps you should give the lecture. Yes. And we can just go and have a cup of coffee.
We can learn from you.
Okay, well, will you please tell us, Seller, Margaret, and others, if something has gone wrong again? Otherwise, we'll just keep talking for a couple of days and no one will hear us. Fortunately, we're good friends, although we've been married for 56 years, because we've been married for 56 years. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a tremendous pleasure to do what was meant to be an introduction to your wonderful conference today and tomorrow. And we have put this short presentation together, assuming at the crack of dawn this morning, we would set the scene and then leave you younger colleagues to proceed and to try and sort out the problems of elephant conflict. Now, we have given this, and Sarah summarized it very well, we've given our lecture a subtitle, Human-Animal Conflict, a Growing Challenge. We are, in the next few slides, going to talk about elephants, of course, but we want to put them in the context of the other human-animal conflicts. It's all part of that spectrum.
We'd like to introduce ourselves, in addition to your very kind introduction, Stella, to say that we're John and Margaret Cooper. We're a husband and wife team, as you've mentioned, and not just a veterinarian. John is also a wildlife pathologist and also very knowledgeable and experienced in animal forensics and wildlife forensics. For myself, I'm a British trained lawyer, but my main interest is in animal law and legislation. On the left here, we look very clean and smart and tidy. We can manage that. And we were therefore to receive an award for some of the work that we've done and our writings in forensics. But our heart is really very much more in the picture on the left. We are much happier on the right, sorry. On the right, where we're sitting in Africa alongside some of our friends and colleagues in the African bush, right? And the other thing to say is that we're very much of the view, although we're based in Britain, we believe in this, as this quotation at the bottom of the slide shows, living abroad is a very different thing from traveling abroad. And we've been fortunate to live in a number of parts of the world, represented by the terrains here. In the top row, we lived in Arabia, in Europe, and also in the West Indies. But we have to say that it is the bottom row where we've left a large chunk of our hearts. In East Africa, sorry to say, not much association with West Africa, but in East Africa, and also in Rwanda, when we worked with the madrigals in the Virunga Mountains.
You're probably all wondering why we were asked, two elderly Brits who are based in Britain, but going back to Kenya in August, why we were asked to do your introduction. And actually, Dr. Sella gave you the answer, because we're in the last few weeks of completing this book about the science and law of human-animal conflict. Because of time, we won't say much more about it. You can see the names of the authors there, and the picture on the right will almost certainly be on the cover of the book. It is appropriate. Picture in Kenya, Charles Foster and myself, and an elephant coming in to see how we're getting on with the book. Now, human-animal conflict, we will, of course, be talking about elephants. And the top left there, you can see an elephant in Kenya at a game lodge. But as we said, we want to broaden this a little bit. And certainly talking to African colleagues, we want to remind you that there is a clash between humans and animals across many spectra, both in terms of species and terrain and so on. Now, when I mention slides, I'll start at the top on the left and move to the right. I won't keep saying second slide, second picture, third picture. So, for example, many of you in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, will be familiar with the quelea, the passerine birds. You can see them flying over a lake there, that decimate crops at times, as indeed do locusts. And both of those are an example of human-animal conflict. The third one there will surprise you. It's a dog's mouth. But it is important to remember that the best documented throughout the world example of animal damage to humans is in fact dog bites. In most countries of the world that applies. And that's not just important from the point of view of domesticated animals, but many of you will know that dogs can transmit rabies and other infections. So there is a wildlife component. Right, well, why do animal-associated incidents occur? And remember, we're broadening it quite a lot. Well, the first immediate answer is because there is so much increased contact between humans and animals, both domesticated and wild. And we thought it was appropriate, as this program was produced by our friends in LCA, based in South Africa. The top left is an example. This is Palabora Mine, which is very near to Kruger National Park. A picture from our friend Dr. Fiona Sack here at the London Zoo, who did her PhD on the elephants that wander through the mines there, or wander near them, and largely because they are after minerals, and of course the mine is in a good place for minerals. That's a story in itself. So we start off with that. That's an example of increased contact with elephants. But if we move to the right, remember about towns, cities, urbanization. These little children here are in India, in one of their enormous cities. You can see them with their dogs there. They're very, very close to their animals, and everyone is very close to everyone else. But if you move to the right, a picture of a modern city, not here in Britain, in the United States, we are often very proud of our urbanization, our big cities and so on. But all of these things are bringing us, Homo sapiens, human beings, into closer contact with animals. So in the United States, where our daughter lives, a large city might, if it's a sprawling city, might gradually take over territory, for example, where bears live. And then there's a conflict between bears and humans. But even here in sunny England, I'm looking out of the window at the sun, we have some of these problems. On the far right there is an urban fox or a suburban fox here. They come through our garden. We like to see them, but they can do a lot of harm. On the bottom left, you can see a herring gull, which is a Palearctic gull there, one that comes regularly and taps on our windows here and makes a bit of a pest of itself. We like it, but they can sometimes attack people. The car that you can see in the bottom picture there, the cars, you can see a road accident. Our car was the one on the left, and this very unpleasant accident occurred as a result of a deer, D-E-E-R, and we'll mention that again later. But as far as our friends and colleagues in Africa are concerned, the relevant pictures really are the last two. The one that you can see from Uganda, where you can see protected area, forest, the windy impenetrable forest on the right, and you can see that very clear-cut boundary between that and grazing land on the left, and indeed human dwellings in the front. And it's this interface that has been referred to already and will come up time and time again today and tomorrow that is producing problems. And the final picture at the bottom, 2 years ago when we were in Kenya in Samburu, this camel has not been attacked by an elephant, but it was one of a number that had been attacked by lions, and I and veterinary colleagues were examining it. Right, well, Sela mentioned that I have a microscope, I'm a veterinary pathologist, etc. So obviously I'm interested in the injuries that animals, including elephants, can inflict on human beings and indeed on other animals. They can inflict very severe soft tissue injuries, top left. They can break human bones. You can see the bone there. They can kill people. You can see the picture there below the bone. That is a woman who was not killed by an elephant, but was killed by a crocodile in East Africa. And this is the scene at her post-mortem examination. And if we look at the elephant on the right, I don't need to tell this erudite audience that LCA has put together that you can see all the features that make elephants dangerous in physical terms. You can see the size, the weight, the trunk, you can see the tusks. You can imagine how easy it is, and some people experience this, of course, for an elephant to crush you, to trample on you, to kneel on you, or to pierce you with its tusks. But bottom left, because we have worked in different parts of Africa, including with the mountain gorillas in Rwanda and indeed in the Congo and Uganda to a certain extent, we see other species such as gorillas and the great apes as dangerous to humans at times. You Africans will recognize a Nile crocodile there. You'll recognize a boomslang snake, a rear-fanged snake, and you may or may not recognize the species of amphibian down there, but the frog. But all of those can have an adverse effect on the health of human beings. And then we move to the last two pictures here, because the word zoonoses is in the title. Zoonoses are infections and diseases that can be transmitted from animals to humans. That dead elephant may or may not have died of a zoonotic infection, but since we have a number of Zimbabweans, many Zimbabweans, I think, in the audience, you may remember that about 5 years ago, you lost a lot of elephants. It was thought at first it was going to be anthrax, which of course is transmissible, very transmissible to human beings. But your scientists, led by our friend Dr. Chris Foggin, veterinary pathologist, were able to show it was due to a novel Pasteurella type like bacterium. And that is relevant when we're talking about elephants. The final picture, far right there, is our veterinary colleague, Dr. Jessica Kareri in Kenya, and she's been very much involved with the hand rearing of orphaned elephants, which is carried out in many parts of the continent of Africa, but that, of course, also carries risks of infection. Now, let's move on then to what elephants can do to property and economic interests. And your audience actually know more about this than we do. Ours, again, is a broad sweep, and we look at it from our viewpoint. The approach of an elephant, top left there, is either very exciting if you're a tourist, or horrifying if you happen to be a landowner in Africa. If you look at the second picture there, it might be an elephant that's in someone's maize field, quite a big farm here. That's bad enough, but look at the little shambers, the little small holdings in the background there. The approach of an elephant or elephants is a very, very bad sign, and you fear for your crops. Look at the maize crop on the right that's been trampled by elephants, and you fear, of course, for your houses. Look at the little house in the bottom row there. For vegetation, look at the acacia, bottom left there, and for your property. And the bottom right is a water tank in Kenya, which we photographed when we were there at a place where a particular elephant is a problem. You see, it has pierced the water tank with its tusks. It's torn it apart. The water is lost, and there was no obvious reason. This seemed just to be vandalism because there was water around. So how do we investigate such incidents? So this is my particular love, because as you know, Margaret and I do forensic work. But do notice the subheading here. we say investigation of alleged human-animal incidents. Throughout the world, there is a tendency to point an accusing finger at animals and say, oh, it had to be the baboons. Oh, it had to be the neighbour's dog. Oh, that infection came from that parrot that someone was keeping in a shop in Nairobi or Kisumu. And so one has to be careful. People may be after compensation, they may be after publicity, etc. But we would like to put, in the short time that we've got, and I'm trying to make this short, put over the point that we investigate alleged human-animal incidents of any sort by using a forensic method. The bottom two books there on the right are ones that we wrote or contributed to, and each of these explains the crime scene investigation when you're dealing with wildlife incidents, whether it's humans doing things to animals or animals doing things to humans. So top left here, you see Margaret there in Kenya discussing with a gentleman alleged wildlife crime there, not specifically elephants. Then moving to the right, if you don't know whether the story is true, you need to have evidence. So you can see I brought in some branches there, which almost certainly had been torn by elephants. You may have to look for tracks and trails. You may have to look at feces, which of course I love doing, the fourth picture along there, not only to ascertain, yes, there are elephants here, but how old are these feces? When did that elephant pass? What was it eating, etc. This is real nature detective work. And far right, there might be evidence, in this case of lions, not of elephants. Those are camel bones there, and they were strongly suggestive that a camel had been killed in that location, not recently, a few weeks before. And then, of course, moving down in our pictures, you might be fortunate enough to find the elephants that you think were involved. You might ascertain, the first picture there, that they've got youngsters, which of course immediately is likely to make elephants more sensitive to human presence and possibly take action that they wouldn't normally. You might get sufficiently close, look at the next two pictures there, to elephants to ascertain one of those there has got a swelling on its leg. Well, as a veterinary pathologist, I would love to investigate that. It might be an arrow. It might be some splinters from a building or trees that is knocked down. And on the right, there's an elephant actually urinating. Well, if we get urine from elephants, we can find out a lot about where they've been, what they've been eating, etc. But I challenge the LCA audience today, even though you're all proper Africans, not half Africans, nusu like us, would one of you like to go and collect a sample of urine for us, and I could look at it in the lab? I suspect most people would say, no, that's dangerous, and indeed it is. But it's important to remember that material from the elephants, live or dead, is very, very important. And then bottom row there, laboratory tests, sophisticated ones. Back in the laboratory, bottom left, DNA studies, of course, stable isotope studies, those sort of things. But moving over, just looking at samples with a hand lens, that's in my lab here in Britain, identifying hares, for example. Elephants are no great problem, but differentiating other species, big cats, for example, can be difficult. And you see a scene in the field there doing much the same. So the investigation is very, very important. Next slide, please. And then the last part from me, and then you'll have Margaret, who is much more sound than I am, is prevention and mitigation. Well, the first thing is we have to understand elephants. And your last speaker put this over very clearly about research workers and conservationists and working with anyone who's got knowledge or can produce knowledge and information about elephants. And we'll concentrate on elephants at this stage. The top picture on the left there is a scene from Save the Elephants in Kenya when we were there a couple of years ago with our colleagues. And then on the right, a reminder that local people in the broadest sense may know much more certainly than we do about elephants. They will know about their behavior, be able to identify individual elephants, follow tracks and so on. So and local knowledge is so important. And then what sort of things can be done to prevent or mitigate elephant damage? You people will hear much more about this today and tomorrow, and we will try and tune in when we can, but we've got a fairly busy schedule, unfortunately. But electric fences, as in Kenya, can be used. Beehives can. The work of Lucy King here in Kenya, there in Kenya, we live in two countries really, and 2010, and others has shown how elephants dislike bees, they sting them in the trunks and all that sort of thing. You know these sort of things. And then moving down the pictures there, Margaret and a colleague of ours in Kenya, simple warning devices, pieces of metal that can be attached to fences so that at least the landowners, the people who own that little shamba or whatever, know an animal or perhaps a human is approaching. And then moving right across to the right, one can use drones, of course, as is being done there in Kenya, to monitor the movement of elephants. And bottom row, there's the use of lights. This is a project in Kenya, putting out lights that simulate a guard and a askari going around the bomas at night. The lights flash in different places and they're solar powered, which is good. And then you've got GPS, applying it to animals. I should say that is not an elephant. It is, in case anyone's fallen asleep and wakes up and says, what's happening? That is a cow in a conservation area, one of many here in Britain. And then the last three slides, we think as old people, as Wazee, who like working with young people, education is so important. We've got two pictures there from Kenya of the young lady there with her dogs. Now, dogs are part of this picture, as we said before. And then we've got our friend, Dr. and colleague, Dr. Jessica there, and she's vaccinating these animals and telling the local people about how to look after them and how to combat or prevent human-animal conflict. But it's quite patronizing, really, for us as a couple of Brits, Wazungu, to say, oh, you've got to teach the local people. Some of the worst offenders in terms of deaths, injuries, irresponsible behavior are, of course, the people who come in from outside. Bottom right. Margaret Cooper is in the picture. She is not a tourist. But so many tourists do silly things to get a photograph, to get near to elephants, to get near to other animals. And they very often need the education that, as I call them, proper Africans can give and explain the psychology and the importance of elephants as species. So that is where I finish, I think. And now I'll hand over to Margaret.
Thank you very much. And I have two more possible considerations for you. That may be part of your conference, and if not, it will be in the background of the projects and the actions that you put into practice in dealing with human wildlife, human elephant conflict. I'll start with the ethical considerations. I divide them into two parts. One is the philosophical or theoretical arguments about how we ought to treat animals, what is our relationship with animals, what are the priorities between human and animals, and how do we manage to balance those. But I think much more immediate and practical, which is perfectly clear from the lectures that we've had already and will continue. What about the human needs? What about the humans who have a need to a life, to liberty, to making money to support the family and to look after their livestock and property? And then there's the other side. What about animal welfare? Elephants are not always, as clear, always free living, where many of the conflicts occur, but they come under the control of people when they're being translocated, reintroduced, or using other methods of movement. And also, as is shown in the picture on the bottom right, some elephants, the young ones, are taken into rescue rehabilitation.
That's a young John Cooper, taken some years ago when I had hair.
He's not praying, he's watching the drip.
But it's a good thing to pray at the same time.
And the point is that we owe that to animals once they're under our control or under our care. Now, the other thing to say is, I'm sure that your main preoccupation is with the legislation that controls free living wildlife. Top right, top left picture, an elephant from Kwale in Kenya, and the legislation that gives the power to the government, and so on. But there are many other pieces of legislation which are relevant to animals, usually in different varying circumstances, but they can overlap. So if you have an animal that is in captivity, yes, this is an Indian elephant in the zoo, but remember, I've just said about the welfare implications, but there may be animal health implications and authorizations needed and tests and documentation if you are moving elephants from one place to another. In the Indian subcontinent, there are other considerations as well. Elephants are kept in the temples. They have a special status as sacred animals, which controls what you can and can't do with the animals. Welfare is a strong issue there. And then again, there are animals that are elephants that are used for working animals in the subcontinent. And again, the responsibilities, because they're under a person's control, involve welfare. But also, there's the ownership of the elephants, and very important, liability. And that question of liability, when accidents, injury, death, damage to property occurs, runs throughout the legislation. That doesn't matter whether it's an African or an Indian elephant, and runs alongside the wildlife conservation law. Now go on to actual legal considerations, and this is where particularly I'm talking about the government legislation, and that is the fundamental question: who is responsible for wildlife? In this case, is it your government, is it the states or provinces? If you think about Nigeria, I think that it said that the wildlife is devolved to the various states. It's a very large country. I'm not sure. It's something that you can compare and contrast in a meeting like yours. And what about the responsibilities of landowners, the conservancies, and so on? And I have mentioned liability already as an issue. And then to find the answers to some of these things, you have to go back to the Constitution, which may say that the wildlife is the property or the responsibility of the government and the country, and then looking in detail at the wildlife legislation and what it allows and so on. So in a conference like yours, I don't know how deeply you're going into legislation, but bottom line is, how does the current law deal with conflict? It's a matter of reviewing that and looking at the framework that you've got already. And I'll put in address at the end, because a lot of compensation comes through the government schemes and so on. I have read that in Kenya, they have revamped their compensation scheme to make it more accessible. So it's going down to the county level for reporting and so on. You don't have to go all the way to central government to claim compensation. And money is being paid out at the moment to re-energize that issue. And I'm sure you'll hear that from the Kenyans. And then what about the future? Because I imagine once you go through your conference, the winding up sessions will be involving what can we do, what improvements do we want, what legislation needs attending to. And of course, before you have legislation, you have policy. The government has to formulate a policy. I've heard mention of that already. That has to be your proposals have to reach the policy, then be put into legislation. And what new powers do we want? And so what can be done? And the other thing, which is again on the African continent, I've heard it discussed and so on, the question of enforcement. This particularly lies with the problems of poaching and illegal trade and so on. But enforcement powers have to be strong enough to support the rest of the provisions in the legislation. And also it's important to educate the people who are carrying out that enforcement, the police and the judiciary. So I hope this has given you some ideas for discussion. You may say, oh, we planned it all already, which would never surprise me. But we do hope you enjoy your conference and come out with some good solutions.
And we've got one more slide, but it's very quick. And we're aware that Margaret Cooper, who organizes these, is very tough on time, not as kind as Sela is. So we must move on and finish, Margaret. Next slide, please. all we have to say to all we have to say to you is Asante sana. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Team Coopers. Yeah, it's really interesting, and this is a fascinating talk to see how law and science are used in human wildlife conflict. Yeah, so I won't take much of the time. Let me open the floor to questions. Let's hear from our audience. If you have a question, you can raise your virtual hand then.
If there's no question, we've got a funny slide at the end that will at least make people laugh before they have their lunch.
I'm sorry, my fingers slipped.
Do you want us to show you that?
Yes, please, you can.
We just wanted, and it's a joke against myself, if we ever find it. When we were in Kenya a couple of years ago, we stayed with our friends in the Rift Valley, and at night, because we're old people, they thought, they had us escorted or taken by Land Rover round to the tent where we were staying because of an elephant in the way. Well, the next morning, will that move on to the next picture? Yeah. The next morning, I wandered out from the tent. We haven't got the picture, but I'll tell you this. I wandered out from the tent. This is not a picture of me sitting in the Rift Valley enjoying the Rift Valley. I have just been knocked down by that Baran bull on the left. Fortunately, I fell against the tree on the right there, and the Baran bull is just thinking about whether he'll come back for a second time. I was assured this Baran bull is part of the farm, an old mzee that's been there for years, almost as old as I am. Don't worry. And in any case, they said, you're a veterinary doctor. So I go up and talk, as Dr. Seller would, to the Baran bull, and would you believe it? He puts his head down and he charges at me and knocks me over. The purpose of this, apart from bringing a little bit of levity to your meeting, is to remind you of two things. One is, as we said at the beginning, elephants are really important, but then so are lions, so are crocodiles, so are sharks. But your topic is elephants today. But any animal, and particularly in Africa, where so many people keep livestock, there are many, many more deaths and injuries, of course, from domesticated animals than from elephants. And the second one is to remind you not to rely, you're very respectful in Africa to old people like me. Take no notice of the old people. They get knocked over by bulls. You young people are the future. Whether you work with elephants or bulls, we wish you the best of luck. And we're still happy to take questions if there are any.
Thank you so much. I really had a good laugh just now. Yeah,
Well,
that's one
good.
thing about our profession. Yeah, there is a question from Simon. Simon, would you like to ask your question?
Oh, good old Simon.
Hello, Simon.
Hello, Simon. How are you?
Hello. Good afternoon, the Coopers.
Santi.
I'm asking, how can you effectively balance conservation goals with the needs of rural communities, especially in areas with recurring conflicts?
The question was about balancing conservation needs with the needs of the community. Yes?
Yes. Yes.
Well, there are plenty of examples, both with African elephants and Asian. If you don't mind me referring to Asian, they've got some really good projects there. And we've been collating them, of course, for our book. And we can certainly provide references to you in different parts of India, in particular, and Nepal, and in Sri Lanka. They have projects there whereby the communities adapt to the elephants rather than expecting the elephants to adapt to them. So they plant different plants. They put paddy fields in, for example, rice fields, in a place where the elephants are. The elephants then eat the paddy, the rice, and they tend, it doesn't always, but tend not to make their way to the more important crops that are being grown on farms, on shambas, etc., etc. That's just one example. And of course, as our colleagues at this conference today will verify, there are plenty of projects in East, some in Central, some in West Africa, where they have managed to get the right sort of balance. But it does need a tremendous amount of work. It needs liaison with the local people. And I think as much as anything, and this was alluded to before, one needs to convince local people that the elephant should be seen as an asset. They should be thinking in terms of coexistence rather than conflict. If we get away from this word conflict, although we use it in our book, but getting that message over is difficult, but it's much, much easier with young people. There is a program in Kenya, as you possibly know, Simon, that's called The African Queen. It's a film, and it's a film about the plight of elephants, led by a female elephant called Athena, and how she moves her elephants around because of drought and goes long distances and the problems she encounters. And this film is shown in Kenya, and I suggest it ought to be shown elsewhere. And it's taken out into the Porini, into the bush, etc. And people sit around rural communities and they watch this film, and they've done a proper survey of it. People go away, particularly the young people, with a feeling we must do more to work with elephants, with wildlife, rather than seeing it as a challenge. That's a very long answer, but we know you well, Simon, so we guessed you would leap up and ask us a question, and we were worried in our boots as to what you were going to say.
I'm happy with the explanation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon. All right, there is a hand from Jeff. Jeff, would you please unmute?
Thank you, everyone who has presented. My name is Jeff, and I come from Kenya. I have a question relating to compensation. I think Dr. Margaret Cooper talked about some compensation, but I had a question on that because you realize that not all animals are compensated. So my question is, like baboons and monkeys, they normally destroy crops and they're not compensated. How can we ensure that we reduce wildlife conflict when the compensation is not all encompassing, like not all animals are compensated for if they destroy crops? How can we go about this to ensure that we reduce human wildlife conflict?
Yes, I think this is it's of course a problem because it's a limited list of species that from which you can get compensation. Baboons are notorious. We ourselves have lost chickens to baboons against the advice of our Ascaris that look after our property, I have to say.
When we had a property.
Yes, they said, oh, you've got to keep them indoors. And my husband says, oh, give them a little bit of exercise. They need some fresh air, as you might say. They need to scratch around in the earth. And but it's by the end of the day, there weren't any chickens left. The baboons had come up from the river and dealt with them. So, and also behind us, someone had some property. They grew a crop there. And I think that in the end, any profit went to the baboons. But it's a constant problem. And all one can do in those cases, because it's based on the list that is put in the legislation, and that's based on government policy, is you've got to try and get the policy changed and then the legislation. But that takes a huge momentum. It's all right for people with obvious large fauna like the elephants and so on, but because that's taken for granted. But with the smaller ones, and also it's happening all over the place. It's an urban problem as well in places. I can imagine that the government will need a lot of persuasion to take it on, simply because the prospect of the costs and so on.
And also, could I add, they would argue, certainly in Kenya, well, there are alternative ways of dealing with baboons and other smaller animals if you don't like the compensation situation. And I'm thinking of translocation. As you probably know, Bwana, the Kenya Wildlife Services and indeed the Institute of Primate Research based in Karen in Kenya will translocate, will move baboons, vervets and others to other places. But we all know that doesn't work terribly well. Ask anyone who's got a shamba and he'll say, oh, the monkeys will come back. So we sympathize. And of course, we have no real clout in Kenya, although we love being there and discussing these things with our colleagues. I think the Kenya government would argue that there are alternative ways of doing it. And translocation is one. And of course, sometimes animals have to be culled. And again, that must be done through the authorities, Kenya Wildlife Services taking the lead. But good question. Thank you. And it's very nice to hear from you.
Yep.
And we may meet you sometime, perhaps in Kisumu, and eat some fish with you.
Thank you so much. And someone has written in the chat that Karibu Sana, the Coopers. Thank you so much for, yeah, thank you for your time. And we know that you're very busy people, but you made time to interact with the students and our audience today. We really appreciate that. And thank you, Yoranda and Lindy. So I will just share my screen again so that we should see what we have got from today's talks. So today we had like 3 talks, and I hope from the talk that we just had now, you have gained a foundational understanding of human-animal conflict, its legal and ethical dimensions, and the challenges of balancing human interest and wildlife welfare. And from Yoranda's talk, I hope you have explored the drivers and complexity of human-elephant conflict in Zimbabwe and discover what true coexistence means for affected communities. And lastly, from Dr. Lindy, I hope you now understand how social media shapes public perceptions of human-elephant conflict, often amplifying distant voices while silencing those most affected. With this, I would like to thank you all for joining us, and please join us again tomorrow as we continue the workshop. Thank you so much and have a good afternoon. Masana Abwino, that's what we say in Malawi. Bye.